Hey, it's Kevin from KDW Mixing and Mastering. This week I thought I would show you how I use the Waves InPhase plugin to get the drum tracks all set up and in phase and sounding great before I even do anything else to them. So we've got a drum track here. I've got all these just laid out. I've done nothing really with them. I've just done a little bit of clip gain just to get the levels to a nice level. Not too loud, not too soft. And we're going to check the phase. So what I like to do first is, in this case, I've been given a overhead that's been separated in left and right tracks. Now, a lot of other times I will get one stereo file, which is an overhead left and right. So the same concept applies either way. If I had a single stereo track, I would be putting InPhase on the single stereo track. In my case, I'm going to put it on a bus, which I have. So I have the left and right going to a bus to sort of make it pseudo a stereo track. And I'm going to put InPhase on that. So we're going to use the stereo version. So what I like to do first is, generally I like to use the overheads as my master source. Okay, so it's a good idea to pick something where everything is going to relate to it. So because the overheads generally capture pretty much the entire kit, I like to use them as my source. Now the first thing I always do with my overheads is first I check that the overheads are actually in phase in a stereo situation, so the left and right channels are in phase. So I'm not going to go into all the little details of Waves InPhase because, to be honest, I don't use all of the complicated stuff. I probably should, but I don't. I do it quite simply. So in this mode here, I've got the A channel is channel 1, B is channel 2. So this is looking at the stereo field, so it's looking at the left and right. So generally what I'll do is I flick this switch to capture, I'll play a bit of audio and it will capture a little bit and then stop. Okay, so then what we're going to do is we want to find a drum hit. Anyone will do, either a kick or a snare, doesn't really matter. We just pick one that looks good. And I just move this line to line up with the start. I usually look at the reference of that top one. And then we zoom in. Now the interface on this is a little bit clunky. It's very slow. It's not the best plugin I've ever used, but I got it dirt cheap in a Wave sale, so I thought, why not use it? So then I keep tweaking this line as I go in. Okay, and you'll also see down here, here's the correlation meter. When it's in the blue like that, that usually means it's in phase and it's good. If it moves over to the orange side, so we can show that, like if I flip the phase of the B channel, you'll see it instantly go across to the orange. That's bad, that means it's out of phase. So we want it in the blue, but you can also get it like a big expanse of blue. So, and this is where it becomes a little bit, you've got to tweak, So I'm lining up this hit here at the start here, or you could go at the peak. Now maybe the peak is more appropriate here because it seems to be closer. But for instance, if I did it from the very start, looking at this one here, you'd see that's a little bit off there. So what you can do then is you grab the dial on this one here and you can move it back. Okay, so what you can also do then is, so let's say you've done that. Is that better or worse? Well, that's what you can find out. So what we can do is, I've just adjusted A. We've got a B channel here that's flat, back to normal. Okay, so we can then play and switch between the two and hear the differences. So let's do that. I don't hear anything obvious there. I'm not sure, is it worth doing? One thing to look for would be that correlation line there. The amount of blue there can grow, so if we were to put that back to 0, now see that got a bit wider, so the correlation is probably better. And I think the reason is because the initial hit's not really accurate. You're more looking at the peak of there. You'll see the peak there. It's pretty spot on. So in this case, the overheads, they're in phase. So the left and right are in phase, which is good. So now our next step is to now check the rest of the drum kit compared to the overheads. So I'm going to leave this in phase on the stereo of the overhead, or like I said, if it was a single stereo file, it would be sitting on there. And this is my main source. Now what we need to do in Cubase is we're going to turn on this button here, which activates the side chain. And what you also want to do now is you want to click on here so that now the A channel is channels 1 and 2, so that's stereo, and this is now our side chain. Okay, so let's say we start with our kick. So I'm going to solo the kick with the overhead, and what we need to do is we need to go to our sends, and we need to find our side chain here. So you'll see here's the side chain, overhead, in phase, stereo. So we're going to send to our side chain, make sure we turn it on. We're going to send all the signal. I'm putting it into pre-fader just so that I can turn the fader up here. So what we're going to do is, okay, so let's just start assuming that we've got this right. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to capture. And so we're going to play a part of the track again and capture. So let's just zoom back out, and what we need to do is we need to find a kick. So once we find one, we zoom in. Okay, so if you look in this case, the correlation meter is saying that it is out of phase. So the very first thing you could do is obviously put it in phase. So that's not bad. Okay, so let's hear what that does. So I'm going to play it and I'm going to flip it. Now you might say, well, it actually sounds worse. The problem is, with the way this works, is this plugin here will play what's coming through the side chain as well as the normal. So it's playing the overhead. It's also playing the kick that's coming through as a side chain. But what happens in Cubase, because there's a solid here, the kick is also playing itself. It's playing as not phase flipped, so it's basically almost cancelling itself out. So the way I've found to do this is why I put it in pre, is to turn the fader down on the kick. So all we're hearing is what is coming through this plugin on here. So if we do that same thing again, so we can also have a listen to the mono mix to see what it sounds like in mono. So this is with the unaffected. Then we go back to stereo. Now you'll hear the low end on the kick just come straight out as soon as I flip the phase on the kick. Okay, so clearly this correlation is accurate. The kick is out of phase compared to the overheads, because as soon as I flip that, you lose all the low end. Okay, so that's the very first thing. Now we could also look at, can we tweak it even further? All right, so now the other thing is you can unlock here if you want to enhance left so that you get a better look. Now I might take it to the peak and we'll see what that does. So we'll see what this correlation meter does when we do that. So we're going to grab this dial. So what I might do first, before we even do that, is I'm going to copy this setting, which is the in phase, because we know the phase reverse, because we know that fixes it. I'm going to copy that across to B. And now I'm going to make this adjustment. And we'll see what that does. See that? If you look at the correlation meter, it's actually making it worse, not better. So looking at that waveform there, you would almost say that that's where it should be, but the correlation meter is not really showing that. So let's actually have a listen and see what we think. So we'll start with A, where we've got this new setting, and then I'll flip across to B, which won't have that adjustment and just have the phase reversal. Let's start that audio again. It's subtle, but I'm sort of hearing that potentially there's a bit more of the impact of the kick coming out. What I'd like to do is just see if we can find another hit. Let's try one of these smaller ones. I just want to have a look at one of those and see what we get. Like I said, the interface for this is very clunky, so sometimes it can be a little bit awkward to work with. So it seems to be consistent with this little peak here lining up with that adjustment. So even though the correlation is a bit wider here, it seems to be more accurate there. But let's have another listen. Yeah, it's so subtle, I'm not even sure if it's doing anything, to be honest. Okay, anyway, let's move on. Let's just take this setting and actually, let's go with B. Okay, so what do I do now? Okay, right, because all I've done is I've got the plugin. Now you can leave the plugin like this if you want. I don't really like that. So I'm going to copy AB. Then what I do, go across to my window here. And then what I do is I click on my kick and I go to, so I'm going to open the mono version of InPhase because the kick drum is mono. Okay, so I'm going to actually process this file. Now I've copied A and B. Now if I was to go paste A was the channel where the overheads were, so there's no settings on that, so we don't want that. So we're going to paste B. Now you see here we've got the phase reversal, and we've got 0. If I had taken the other settings, it would have had that as well. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to process my kick. Now, if I was to play this right now, which I'll do, it won't sound very good. And the reason is because we've still got the InPhase plugin sitting on the overheads doing its job. So if I was to bypass this, we should hear the difference. So the kick should sound good now when we turn the volume up of the kick. Nice. Now I'm going to mute the kick. So again, we're still looking at the overheads as the source. What you'll see here is I have a snare top and bottom mono tracks that are going to a snare bus that I've put there, a stereo bus. So what I would like to do first is, so in this situation here, I'm going to do something a little bit different. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this in, but I'm going to take the bottom out. Now, when it comes to a snare top and bottom, the top to me is always the primary part of the snare. The bottom just adds, you know, the crisp snare sound. But depending on how the top sounds, there might be times where I won't even use the bottom. So I like to use the top as the main thing that I'm looking at. So again, what we need to do, we've still got our send set up on there. So I'm going to send the snare top over to there. We're going to put it on pre. Again, we're going to reduce the volume so that what we're hearing is just the snare in here. I'm going to zoom out initially just so we get a nice picture. Let's drop that back down a bit. Lock that again. Okay, so we've got our settings. Let's go back to, let's copy our B settings back to A. So we've gone back to a default. Everything's clear, all good. All right, so we are now just going to compare the snare top to the overheads. So let's have a listen to that and do a capture. Okay, we've got a capture. Again, this is saying that it's out of phase. So let's line our little marker up. Do a bit of a zoom in. Okay, just move across a little bit. Okay. So it says we're out of phase. You can see here we're also miles away from actually lining up. So we could flip the phase, and in this case that hasn't made it, it seems to have made it better. So let's just try that. Let's have a listen. Absolutely way fatter. Definitely. Okay. But I'm going to put it back for a second, and I just want to have a look. What would happen if we just moved that? So let's just zoom in a little bit more. Take that to the edge there. Okay, so now here's the difference, right? Do we take the top or the bottom? Because they're not quite in line here. And that's the overheads. So probably what we should have done, and that's my fault, we should have lined up the overheads better, because obviously the snare here is not lined up. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to backtrack. As much as that is annoying, whoops, press the right button. I am going to go back to my track here. Okay, so I've got my plugin. I'm going to put it back in stereo mode, and we are going to do another capture. Okay, now I'm all zoomed out so I can't see a thing. Now, which is a snare hit is a good question. Is it obvious? Should be obvious. Snare hits are usually pretty big. Okay, let's just go in here. Alright. Here we are. Now that's interesting. It says it's out of phase. Ah, that is because we have a setting on here. Okay, that looks a bit better. I was wondering why it was so far out, but that was my fault because I still had that adjustment on there from when I looked at the snare a moment ago. So we zoom in here, we can see here, so this is a snare hit. We can see it is a little bit out there. But, so I'm going to line it up. Now, I've just copied that to B, which I shouldn't have done. Okay, I'm going to switch between A and B again, and we're just going to have another listen to these overheads. So let's start with B, which is the unaffected, and then we'll switch over. It's funny, I'm hearing the snare move. I've got headphones on and I'm hearing it move as the adjustments. So without the adjustment, it's sort of sitting a little bit on the left. And when I make the adjustment, the snare comes more into the center. It's a weird thing, but there's also a volume thing with this overheads. I'm not sure how the overheads have been done. They're really weird. And you'll hear when you get to the sort of chorus bit, the cymbal is just blaring in one ear. So I'm going to have that setting there, and I'm going to apply that. Now this is where it gets tricky. So this is channel 2, so I'm going to want to apply it to the right channel to get it to sit, and then wipe this setting out. So I'm just going to do the copy. I'm going to close that, switch my window. So we're going to process the right channel. With the InPhase mono plugin. Now, if you had a single overhead stereo file, then what you would do is you would have copied the A/B, you would paste both A and B, you would open the InPhase stereo plugin, and you would process it, and then it would write, obviously, what these settings are, as in A and B, the adjustments we made. So it's just basically writing the plugin setting we had. When you do it in mono, the A side is the one that always affects this channel. B, you'll see here it says SC, it's the side chain only. So we don't need to have any settings in there. So I'm going to process that. Okay, so we've processed. And then we go across back over here. Okay, so we obviously want to wipe out our settings here. Okay, I'm going to do another capture just to show you what it looks like after it's been affected. And instantly, so here's the new capture. You'll see I've got no settings on here, this plugin, and they're in line. So that's because I processed the actual file. Alright, so now that I've gone backwards and wasted some time, let's now get back to that snare. So let's solo this snare. Let's take the snare bottom off. Let's check we've still got our side chain on. Beautiful. Let's do a capture. Okay. Let's line ourselves up with a snare. Zoom in. Across. Okay. So, I mean, this looks a little bit more obvious again. Now that these two are lined up, we know what we're lining up to. So you'll see here, it's back here. Here it is in the overheads. Nowhere near the same position. So again, like I said, when we did that phase, it sounded nice. See, now it says it's in line now, but just check I've got no settings. No, I don't. So let's have a listen now when I've done that to what it sounds like with the phase switch. Still sounds a lot better, but let's now do it just with the lining up and let's see what we get there. So let's line that up there. So you can have a look at the correlation meter down the bottom to see what it's doing as you're doing it. But it is only a guide. So you could zoom in a little bit more. You could line that up even closer. And we could see, and that's sort of spot on. But as you see, the waveforms aren't exactly the same because you've got a close mic on a snare and you've got the snare that's coming through on the overheads, which is not close mic, it is distant, so it is further away. And that's where the test for this will be, is what will it sound like when we do this? So we still have nothing in B, so let's start with our no setting in B and we'll switch across to A. So that's interesting because it seems to it wipes out most of the other sound and it makes the drums sound very dead. So even though visually, by looking at it here, it looks like that's where it should be. See how buggy this is? It's ridiculous. Anyway, it doesn't sound as good. It's like it's cancelling out the rest of the drum kit. And then I'm going to, I think we'll do the phase thing again. Let's have a listen. Let's put it in mono and try it in that. Yeah, I definitely prefer it phase switched. Okay, so what we're going to do now is, I'm not going to copy the settings because we know we're just swapping the phase. So in this case, I could just use the phase switch in Cubase, but I'm going to process it because it's something that I don't have to worry about whether it's turned on or not. So I'm going to turn that on. Now again, we could also do it in Cubase has probably got a phase reverse. Since it is just a phase reverse, let's do that. So I'm going to process that with a phase reverse. And then to prove that that actually did what we think it did, let's capture it again. Settings off. Let's put it in stereo. And let's do another capture. Okay, capture is done. We're not really going to see what we want to see here because of that lining up there. So I think you can actually see why the phase reverse works, because with the different distance in place, you'll see the peak here is lining up. So it's more about that peak than the actual start of the snare. It's the peak of the snare there that's more critical, and flipping that phase there has got it more in line. So to prove the point, let's just play it and let's switch the phase and make sure that we don't like it anymore. Okay, I think it's done what it's meant to have done. So that is good. Alright, now you could do this with all of your tracks. I don't usually bother. I don't go and do all the toms and everything else, but you could do them all. But what I do want to do right now is, obviously snare top and bottom is a common thing. It can be out of phase. So I'm going to actually copy that across to the snare here. We need to go left and right in this case if you want to do that. Let me do it a different way. This is the correct way to do it. Let's get rid of that. Okay, let's put these both in center because that's where we want them. So what I should be doing is putting a mono version on the snare top. Okay, we're going to put it in, turn the side chain on. And then we are going to, let's get rid of that one as well. We don't need that anymore. We're now going to send the snare bottom to the snare top side chain. Okay, now I'm going to drop the fader on this and turn it on, pre-fader, and then we'll do a capture. So this is the correct way to do it. So now we can line up. So now you'll see here it's saying it is out of phase. But you can clearly see here that this really does look out of phase. Okay, you've got, it's going up here, going down, this is going down, up. And that's quite common for a snare top and bottom because you've got the mics pointing at each other, basically, in opposite direction. So if you took the snare out of the middle, they're both pointing at each other. So they are clearly out of phase with each other when they're looking at the snare. So again, we can prove the point here by just doing this and listening. This seems to be a bit more low end than that. Okay, now remember our snare top has already been adjusted to suit our overheads, so we don't want to adjust our snare top again. We want to modify the snare bottom to the snare top. Okay, so I've copied the AB. Now I'm going to go to the snare bottom and I'm going to process that with a mono in phase. And I'm going to paste, so if I did paste A, that was nothing, but I want to paste B, so it's got our phase, it's got our little adjustment here, and I'm going to process that on our snare bottom. Okay, and we could now turn that one off altogether, and our snare should sound pretty good. Let me turn that up. Now a quick way to hear the difference would be for me to undo and then redo. So you'll hear there that sounds quite thin. And the snare fattens up a bit there. So we put the three of those together. Just turn all those off. We've got no sends anyway, but it should sound nice and fat, which it does. Alright, now we can get rid of that. We don't need that. Let's turn that back on. Now, the toms. Again, we can do the same process. So let's open that up, turn the capture on. Let's go. Alright, what have we got? Okay, we need to find one of these big ones. Will probably be a tom hit. So it says it's in phase, the correlation meter. I'll just have a look. Like I said, I don't get too pedantic about these ones. They're just toms. Clearly they don't line up. Okay, but is that going to make any difference? So let's just do a basic thing. Look at the correlation meter. If I switch the phase, definitely out of phase. Don't want that. Okay, if we move this, now you see how the correlation meter there got quite big, the blue section there, compared to what we had, which was down here. It's quite small, and then we lose it as we go bigger, obviously. So if we zoom in a little bit more, so that's our start of our hit here. Okay, so that would be really in line. Okay, so that's B, that's A. Yeah, we'll do it in mono. Let's have a listen and see if that improved it. It's doing a similar thing to what the snare did. I'm not sure why it's doing that. I'm not quite getting exactly what it's doing, but I'm gonna take a gamble here and I'm gonna copy it. Okay. And I'm gonna turn it off just so that it's off. And I'm actually gonna process that with the mono. Okay, we're going to paste B. Alright, it's just got the movement. No phase switch there. And I'm going to process it. Okay. Now we need to bring the volume up. So let's have a listen. Now if I undo it, there does seem to be a bit more power in the tom there. So I'm gonna leave that setting on. Okay. I just worked out why it's changing the settings, because why it sounds totally different when I switch to B. Because of that setting. So there's a little trick for you when you're switching between A and B. Make sure you have all the settings the same except for the little tweaks you're making, because that's what's throwing me out. Bring in our drums, and now we have this. So hopefully this has helped you in some way, especially if you've got this plugin. If you don't have this plugin, you can probably download a trial. I would suggest you try it. It does a good job at what it does, but I'm not necessarily a fan of the workflow of it. It's very confusing. As you can see, you've got to do lots of little things to get it to sound right, to play right, to compare. If you don't have the right things ticked, you really can confuse yourself, as I confused myself several times there. Now, it may not be the plugin's fault. There could be just its relationship with Cubase. But I wouldn't think it would do anything majorly different in Pro Tools. It would still function very similarly. It could even be harder to use in Pro Tools. Thank you for watching. Any comments, leave them below, and see you on the next video.